get ready for next month's meeting. So at this point, I am going to turn the program over to Larry Wilson, our program chair, who will introduce our speaker tonight.
Thank you, Sally. We're really lucky tonight that we have Stan Searles, the founder and executive director of Global Conservation Connections, and he'll discuss his widely varied conservation career spanning 50 years. In his role as curator of birds and aquatics at the Cleveland Metroparks Zoo, he collaborated with the Ohio Division of Wildlife in the reintroduction of trumpeter swans to Ohio. In that project, he collected wild swan eggs in Alaska, oversaw the incubation of the eggs and rearing of the cygnets before placing them at a holding facility at the wilds near Columbus. He then was involved with releasing the swans over a 3-year period. So we have Stanley to thank for our resident parrot at Sandy Ridge. Later, he partnered with Bioandina, a Venezuelan conservation organization, in reintroducing Andean Condors back into the wild. Stan continued to work with governmental agencies in Venezuela to ensure the success of the program. Since his retirement from Cleveland Metroparks Zoo, he's been involved with conservation programs on a local and international level with Global Conservation Connections. Stanley Searles.
Well, thank you for that introduction. Actually, you just took about half my program, but that's okay. That's all right. Well, as he mentioned, I've spent 50 years in what I call the zoological field. The first 21 were with the SeaWorld Corporation, and then Cleveland Zoo, and then working with a nonprofit. What I'd like to do tonight is spend a little bit of time telling you my impression of the changes I have seen in zoos the past 50 years, and they've been dramatic, especially the past 20 years, and then show you a few of the programs, the conservation programs that zoos have been doing. I mentioned I started in the zoo field. The zoo field took me to the conservation field. It wasn't the other way around. Now, just to give you a little background, people, humans, have been holding animals in captivity about 4,000 years. The first modern zoo, we'll call the modern zoo, was in Europe about 1770. 100 years later, roughly, the Philadelphia Zoo was the first zoo in North America. But from my perspective, the past 50 years, maybe even the past 35 years, zoos have changed and grown and gone through such a paradigm shift, more so than they had in the previous 300 years. And I'll give you some examples of that. Before I get started, I'd like to do a very important defining of terms. When I say zoos, and I'm going to say that a lot tonight, that's my shorthand for zoos and aquariums. But more importantly and critically, when I say zoos, I'm referring to institutions that are accredited by the Association of Zoos and Aquariums in the United States, AZA. That's very important because USDA licenses all animal exhibitors, and only 8.5% of all those exhibitors are accredited AZA institutions. So 91.5% of all facilities holding animals aren't accredited by AZA. So zoos are not zoos. AZA zoos are the standard. Accreditation is extremely difficult. The application procedure, the packets that are sent in of information to even apply, fill binders. There's a multi-team inspection to your facility over a number of days looking at all aspects of zoo operation. So once a zoo is accredited, that designates a standard, a level of excellence that doesn't exist in over 90% of all the other facilities. So that's what I'm going to talk about. Those are the zoos I'm referring to. Now, to take you back to 1969 when I started, and everything's changed a lot since then, but zoos in those days, and this is a general statement, but it's basically true, zoos were pretty static. They hadn't changed much in recent years. They really didn't see much reason to change. The public was happy. Public was coming to zoos. They were seeing animals. They were entertained. They were learning a little bit about them. And so zoos were just kind of functioning as they had for a while. That created a lot of problems. Science and science-based methods were not widely used at all in zoos, even in the 60s and the 70s, which is a little surprising, but science was not driving it. What was driving it was the way people learned about zoo staff learning was from the people that had the job before you. Word of mouth, on-the-job training. That's sort of the whole crux of zoo training in those days. There wasn't science, there wasn't structure, and every zoo did it differently. Additionally, in those days, and even in later years, zoos did not cooperate well with each other. Everyone wanted to be the best zoo, and you were the best zoo by having the most babies, the most cute baby animals, or having unusual animals, or doing something noticeable. But zoos weren't working together in a cooperative manner, really in any way, to any extent, until probably 20 years later. This situation created problems in zoos that weren't really realized by most people at the time, but it was later. Zoo populations did not have good genetic diversity. Zoos managed their animals at their own facility. And if you had a pair of animals that bred well or raised the young well, you just kept breeding them because that was success. You had a lot of babies. That meant you were doing a good job and the animals were doing fine in their environment. That's not the case, but that was the feeling in those days. Also, there was no collection planning. And by that, I mean zoos didn't plan ahead of time what they wanted to display. Many times zoo displays were based on availability of animals, what could fit into a enclosure at the moment. There wasn't planning. And because of that, most animals in those days, a large percentage of the animals, were acquired from the wild, generally purchased from animal dealers to a large extent. Zoos rarely went to the wild themselves to acquire animals. They were acquired for them. And that led to a lot of issues also. And since there was no planning, actually for a while, zoos were a drain instead of being the reservoir of, helping animals. Zoos also didn't work outside what I call their footprint much. If you were the Cleveland Zoo or the Columbus Zoo or the San Francisco Zoo, you pretty much just centered your efforts around that town, around that area. Most zoo visitors come within 40, 50 miles of the zoo. People don't tend to travel long distances to a zoo. Some people do, but the majority of people that go to a zoo are from your local area. And zoos just focused on that. There was also very little, if any, research going on, even in the 70s, which was surprising, but it just wasn't in our mindset. So what changed? And in my opinion, what changed was the 70s. In the early 70s, there was the explosion of concern in this country about the environment. The first Earth Day was 1970. A lot of the important environmental legislation was created in 72, 73. The EPA was formed, Clean Air, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, Marine Mammal Protection Act. All this happened in the early 70s. In the early 70s, people started calling themselves conservationists or environmentalists. The study of ecology became important. This really wasn't widespread before this, and it took a while to get going even in the 70s. I think because of this, zoos started changing because their audience wanted it. Their audience was interested. In some cases, the audience was demanding it. They were getting environmentally educated, and the zoos had to play catch up, and they quickly did. In the 70s, and I'll show you a few examples of this, zoos started cooperating, not so much with other zoos, but with government agencies, with wildlife agencies, with universities, in conducting field research. One of the valuable aspects of zoos is that zoos have the expertise of working with animals, of capturing animals, of taking care of animals, feeding, handling, taking care of infants. Zoos have that body of talent. Federal wildlife agencies tend not to. Universities certainly don't. So those forces joined together in the 70s, and I'll show you a couple examples of that. Probably the big shift and big change started in the 80s. And in the 80s, there was a large effort. And again, when I say large effort, this is in AZA zoos, not just in AA zoos. That's the realm I was in. It was also going on in Europe to some extent, but towards adding science to our profession, scientifically managing collections, scientifically looking at problems, looking for measurables, just bringing science into a world which should have had it many years earlier, just didn't recognize that really needed it, or it just wasn't part of the mindset. This became very important in collection planning, but probably more important in the genetic diversity of the collections. Breeding books, stud books, were created for various types of animals. There's one for lions, there's one for giraffes, there's one for gorillas. But not only that, those animals started to be managed cooperatively, regionally. And by that I mean, prior to this, if the Cleveland Zoo or Columbus Zoo had a collection of gorillas, they decided when they bred those gorillas and which gorillas bred and what they did with them and how they handled them and all aspects of their gorilla husbandry and program. Zoos then said, we need to do this as a cooperative group, because an individual zoo might only have 2, 3, 5, or 6 of any different species. To get genetic diversity, we have to manage them as a group. So these groups were created where gorillas, giraffes, lions, whatever you want to think about, were managed as groups. Committees were formed. These committees would make decisions. So at this point, if Cleveland Zoo wants to breed their gorilla to their female, they would ask for permission. And you're not really asking permission, can I do this? You're saying, is this the wisest move for the population? Using genetic research, using the software that was developed, managing a population of 80 animals, the committee could say, no, this animal needs to be bred here, this animal needs to be bred here. Animals would be moved from institution to institution. It was a cooperative effort and was done by committee. There were some bumps along the road. It always didn't go smoothly, but it was the best for the collection. It was best for the animals. This had a tremendous impact on zoos and the bringing of science into zoos. In the 90s, zoos started recognizing we need to go outside our gates. We need to go and work with animals in areas where they live. By this point, the conservation science models and the ecological models were showing us that there were massive problems in various environments for various reasons, all caused by humans, whether it be overhunting, whether it be habitat destruction, whether it be illegal wildlife trade, any number of things. But there were always problems, and zoos felt we need to go out and work with this. Now, there had been some efforts in the past for zoos, and it still continues, of zoos donating money and raising support for organizations that work on local problems. That's great, and that needs to be done and needs to continue. But zoos themselves started sending their staff and their talents and their efforts out to the wild to address these issues. Again, this was not always a smooth road. It was a little bumpy at first. Zoos, like most conservation organizations of the time, felt the way to fix this was to go out in the wild and fix things. And take our technology and fix things. And we quickly found that, or maybe not so quickly, that's not the way to do it. We need to work with the local population. We need to address their issues. And so that moved on that way. Two more aspects I'll talk about quickly before I show you some of these examples on my slides. Recently, in the past 10 years, zoos have focused on animal welfare, and not only the physical welfare of their animals, but the mental, emotional welfare of their animals. and bringing in psychologists and measuring that. That's been a huge emphasis recently. Probably the biggest change I've seen in recent years is the role of education in zoos and in conservation work. Early on in the 60s, 70s, 80s, even depending on the institution in the 90s, zoo education was pretty much informational. You would go to a zoo and you would see, this is a giraffe, this is what it eats, this is where it lives, this is how many young it has, giving you some information. So you went home knowing a little bit more about the animal. That was good. Zoos quickly realized, and the educational area has grown probably more dramatically than any area, that informational wasn't enough, that the problems that have been identified in the wild, again, wildlife trade or habitat destruction, the public needed to know about those problems, needed to help work on those problems. So educational efforts were made to show the public what was happening in the wild. But that wasn't the final step, because an informed public doesn't necessarily mean a public that's going to take action. So the movement at this point in time, and Cleveland's one of the leaders in this movement, is conservation action driven by connecting people to the animals, getting people to feel empathy towards the animals, getting that emotional connection to that animal. And then when you have that, learn what the problems are, but be given some solutions, some efforts you can take. That's probably the biggest change I've seen in recent years, and it's having dramatic effect. Now I'd like to go to some slides, see if we can do this seamlessly here. Going to bring these up, and I think they're being shared right now.
That's good. Yep, we can see them.
So this slide you see here, these are dolphins. This is Florida. This is in the 70s. This is the beginning of this. Dolphins are very common in Florida, but in the 70s and 80s, actually very little was known about their natural history. And for populations of animals, you need to have that understanding if you ever need to develop management plans or deal with environmental problems. So at this time, SeaWorld of Orlando developed a project, took about 10 years, studying the bottlenose dolphins. You see here that these dolphins are in a circle of net that our boats laid out. You draw the net down. This picture shows dolphin in the water. We're lifting them into the boat. Once you get the dolphin in the boat, that's where the research begins. The dolphin in the boat is kept cool. There's veterinarians there. They're on foam, and they're actually only in the boat about 12 minutes. But during those 12 minutes, information is collected that fulfills dozens of research projects. Blood samples are drawn. From blood samples, you can do an amazing number of studies. Measurements are taken. The animals are cryogenically marked. So from this point on, you can follow these animals for years and know exactly who you're seeing, where they are, who they're interacting with. Another important aspect of this project is it was known that dolphins have 88 sharp teeth to grab fish. They don't chew or anything. But it was known that dolphin teeth have growth rings like a tree. But it was not known how often growth rings were laid down. So National Marine Fisheries Service asked us if we could, once a year, pull a tooth from a dolphin, veterinarian pulling the tooth with dental instruments. And in the first year, we would inject the dolphin with a common antibiotic, tetracycline, which stains the growth rings, which means in coming years, as you would pull another tooth, so throughout the course of the project, the dolphin might have 5 of 88 teeth pulled. But we then could definitively say how often growth rings went down. From that point on, when a dolphin was found deceased anywhere in Florida, you could take the skull, get the tooth, and see how old it was. Invaluable research that was done off this project. The Florida Manatee, again, this is in the 70s. Manatees were having difficulty with boats, with canal dams, with a number of aspects, all human-oriented. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service asked SeaWorld because they had the expertise in handling animals, catching animals, if we could help. We did it in a number of ways. First off, this manatee here you see, this manatee actually took a bad left turn up in the Florida Panhandle and ended up in Mississippi in the winter. The water was very cold. The manatee would have perished. Mississippi Wildlife Department called SeaWorld in Orlando. We drove to Mississippi, captured the manatee, took him back to Florida, and everything was very happily resolved. But this is another example of a wildlife agency, state agency in this case, using a zoological institution or aquarium with their expertise to solve these problems. Baby manatees many times are orphaned. Their mothers will become injured. At this point, it was not known how to bottle feed a manatee, how to raise them on artificial formula. This isn't the greatest picture, but this is a bottle, and there's the nipple. We trained a baby to nurse from a bottle and developed a formula to raise them. And at that point, a number of baby manatees were then able to be raised. Many of them were released. The ones that could not would stay at a facility for educational purposes. Again, it's the zoo's husbandry expertise being used to solve a problem with wildlife. This is high-tech tracking system in the 70s. Today, this equipment would be about 1/50th the size. This is to track manatees. When you study manatees in the wild, they come up for air, they go underneath the murky water. You might not see them for 9 minutes, and you don't know where they're coming up again. Very difficult. The rubber on these color radios you see go around the base of the tail of the manatee. When the manatee surfaces to breathe, that antenna pops the surface, and researchers in a boat, in this case, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, could then plot where the manatee is. If you do this over long periods of time, you can see their range. You can see how far they need to travel. You can see what habitat they need. The hard part is, how do you get these on the manatee? U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service contacted SeaWorld. The manatees frequently will go up to warm water springs in the winter. So we weren't catching and herding manatees. When they came up in the springs, we would put a couple nets across the springs. They're not that wide. Start pulling the manatees in. As you get them close to shore, you can see they're in the net. Now I'm making it sound very easy. These animals weigh hundreds of pounds. And when they decide to start thrashing and moving, half of those people are going to be thrown and have to jump back and grab their nets very quickly. As we pull them to shore, then the research starts. You can see with my pointer here, this person has a piece of paper with a manatee outline. All manatees had a recording done of any scars, any identifying marks. They also had their radio pack on to identify them. At this point, we would, again, take a blood sample. We would do measurements and then turn them loose. This project went on for a number of years, and we were able to acquire a lot of information that wouldn't have been received otherwise. Now we go to a totally different project. This is Antarctica. Actually, if you look at these three people walking here, I'm in the back. SeaWorld embarked on an adventure in the 80s, creating penguin encounters. Penguin encounters were these large exhibits. At the time, they were the largest penguin exhibits ever designed for large numbers of penguins. Prior to this, penguins were kept in groups of 3, 4, 5. Most Antarctic species were not kept. Very little is known about penguins. They spend most of their life at sea. They're only on land a very brief time. No one really knew much about them. We needed to get some baseline information. So SeaWorld would create these exhibits, but SeaWorld would mount expeditions over a number of years to various places to collect penguin eggs, hundreds of penguin eggs at a time. Here's a penguin rookery in Antarctica. You can see the penguins on their nest. Most species of penguins will lay 2 eggs, but usually only rear one of the chicks. There's so much competition for food. It's such a harsh environment. Whether it's in the Antarctic or the subantarctic, usually half of the penguin chicks don't fledge. We would take 1 egg from each nest, which really wouldn't impact the population at all. Take the eggs back to SeaWorld. This is a different location. You see the boat over in the corner of the bay. Excuse me. We lived on that boat for a number of weeks. This is an island, Isla Noir, off the coast of Chile, uninhabited, except for a lot of penguins. A lot of macaroni penguins, rockhopper penguins, Magellanica penguins. And again, the purpose was to go there, do research for a number of weeks, study them in the wild. How much time do they go to sea to feed? What are the nesting hair bonds like? Learn everything we could, and then when we were getting ready to leave, collect the eggs. After our incubators got full and I still needed to get some eggs, I filled my camera bag. These eggs are remarkably strong and handled properly. Breakage was not a problem. In Antarctica, we use this coolers. This is an igloo ice chest. There's a little fan in there to circulate air and a little heating element. This box here controls the batteries to heat the unit, because when we collect the eggs, wherever we are, the eggs are about 98 degrees. At that moment, they have to stay at that temperature until they hatch. So if we're in Antarctica and collecting an egg, we have to keep it at 98, 99 degrees for the days it takes us to get home, so that we have a healthy hatching. Again, we can stack the eggs in this incubator. It wasn't a problem. One important thing to mention here, which you'll see in further pictures, but the minute an egg is pulled from the nest, it receives an identity. It receives a letter number code, which follows that animal the rest of its life. Many times these incubators might have to be carried a mile or two to where the helicopters would pick us up to take us on our journey back home. Everything I just described was the easy part. This is the hard part. We would return to San Diego to the facility. You can see that these eggs all have individual codes, which would correlate. Well, this was pulled out of the nest in Antarctica. That number will translate then to bands from this point on. The incubated. Now, as the birds start to hatch, when the birds start to pip, they have to be put in individual compartments. We can't have 2 or 3 chicks hatch out and be mixed together because we don't know who came from what egg. They hatch here. These chicks that are together, you see the little red thread there, the blue thread. A color coding system is developed. Each bird will start getting thread of different colors on left and right that correlate with the egg number for identification. The difficult part is these chicks, which are a day old here, will be adult size in 60 days. These bands have to be constantly changed because they're growing so quickly. The record keeping is amazing. The birds are fed early on 8 to 10 times a day, usually every 2 hours. When the birds are going to be fed, they first are weighed, then fed, then weighed again. It's all recorded, comments are made, and this is done every time you feed them. You can see this bird has its identification with it. This is how you start to get them to feed. This is not a penguin, it's an ibis, but the technique is the same. The syringe has the formula. There's a little tube. If you notice my middle and index finger on each side of the bill, that stimulates the parent's bill. They quickly, within a day or two, get this technique down, and immediately you put your fingers down, they run their bill up there, open them out, they're ready to go. Feeding goes very quickly. What doesn't go quickly is you're feeding the birds, you're recording data. You see this bird is sitting on the scale waiting for food. Each bird might take 3 to 4 minutes from weighing, recording, feeding, weighing. Gets to be like an assembly line process. But the reality is, when you do this, if you're doing the 8 o'clock feeding, by the time you have fed everybody, recorded all the information, and cleaned up, it's time for the 10 o'clock feeding. And it just goes nonstop until the birds are fledged. As they get older, they don't get fed as often, but it's still a phenomenal amount of labor, which results in these penguin encounters. These are young crested penguins. You see the crest is just forming. They have an identification bracelet. But again, the important part is all of these birds are of a known age. That never happened before. So as the years went on, as the decades went on, we were able to say we had 120 rockhopper penguins. Here is how long they lived. Here's what age they started reproducing. Amazing amount of information that was acquired that had never been acquired before. And this is zoos stepping outside their normal role to do this kind of conservation work. This is another journey that involves eggs, but this is Audubon, so it's got to be eggs. You already had the dolphins and manatee. This is an aerial view of Alaska. You see this little lake here. Each lake would generally have a pair of trumpeter swans nesting on it. At this point, we were working with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We would collect eggs, take them back to the zoo. As the cygnets hatched, they grew very quickly. When they were getting ready to be released, after spending about 1.5 years at the wilds, they would get this identification collar. But for me, the most important part of this project, you see the release here, and that's a wonderful part, seeing the swans released. This is what's established the Ohio population. But for me, excuse me again, the important part was we had all these school children helping us. We had adults here. We made an event out of it, a conservation event. I don't know how many of these individuals became wildlife biologists or became interested in the environment or took some effort as they became adults, but I'll bet a few did. And that was the important part of this. An equally important part, if not more so, was the educational component with this program. Reintroducing trumpeter swans was very important to Ohio. I'll say more important was the work, the educational work that was done with wetlands habitat protection and teaching the public about the wetlands. Ohio has lost 90% of the wetlands it had when European settlers came here. We all know wetlands are important for so many things, for flood control, for wide variety of biodiversity. If we found that if you try to tell the public that wetlands are important, that may be a bit of a hard sell. If you tell them that these beautiful trumpeter swans need wetlands, now it's a little bit easier. So in this program, the reintroduction of trumpeter swans, more money and effort was spent on the educational component to the public than was collecting the eggs, which is really how it should be for most of these projects. Larry mentioned Andean condors. Condors in South America, the Andean condors, in some countries have had problems with their populations. In Venezuela, the population was pretty much gone by the early 1900s. In the mid-1990s, Cleveland Zoo and other zoos worked with a conservation organization in Venezuela to reestablish the condors. And so in North America, many of the zoos hatched Andean condors. They were taken down to South America. These crates all have Andean condors to go to Venezuela. They were taken to the release site and held so they could acclimate before they were turned loose. But again, more importantly in this program, it was the educational component. Condors weren't in Venezuela because people had removed them. If we don't identify those reasons and adjust to them and fix them, reintroducing condors is just taking them, pouring them down a black hole. So the educational, the public awareness component was far more valuable than taking the condors down there. To sort of wrap it up before we take some questions, what I'd like to say is if I've learned anything, my 50 years is 50 years ago, this was zoo education. At this point, killer whales had been in captivity 5 years. If we did a show and told the public a few things about the whales, we felt we were doing our job. No, it wasn't even close. We now know that if we're going to make a difference, we have to work with individuals who live in an area where the problems are existing. This is a picture of the Ohio Young Birders group in Millersburg. Given the resources and given the help, they constructed 60 nest boxes for barn owls and gave them away free to anyone who had a barn. They didn't need us to build nest boxes. They didn't need us to do anything. They just needed some assistance. Working with individuals where they live is the key. Another key we found is working with individuals that you normally wouldn't think of are very important for conservation. We've learned that people who have strong spiritual attachments, whatever that spiritual direction is, many times have the same compassion, the same connection that we're looking to achieve in individuals for a conservation effort. And it's very similar. We need to identify the similarities there. In this case, we were discussing having a nature walk on the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, which was last year in April, and COVID sort of squashed that for us. But the idea of including all types of groups in conservation efforts is the key to what we need to do. And I'm glad it's moved in that direction. So I'm going to stop now and see if there's any questions.
If you have questions, and I want to thank Stan, that was absolutely amazing and so informative. I loved the program. It was terrific. If you have questions, you can type them into the Q&A at the bottom, and we'll try and get to those very quickly. So we'll give you just a minute or two here if you have a question for Stan. We did have a comment that one of our members has a son who works at the Long Beach Aquarium. It's an AZA certified zoo, and she's very interested in the conservation that's being carried on there.
And she's also asking about, is there danger of losing some organizations like zoos during this COVID isolation time?
There is. Zoos, many zoos throughout the country had a difficult time during COVID. Public wasn't going on. Zoos are funded a number of different ways. Some are public zoos, some are governmental zoos, some are privately funded zoos. But yes, COVID had a huge impact. And what zoos will do in this period of time, the last thing that they will save money on is the care and welfare of the animals. That stays at top level no matter what. So therefore, some of the other components, maybe education, maybe some of the support for conservation has to weaken during those times of COVID. So this is the time where the zoo really needs the support of the people around them.
I have a question here from Lisa K. Do you have a favorite kind of animal that you most enjoyed working with?
I'm always asked that. And yes, I do. I would have to say my favorite animal is walrus, and it's purely emotional. Early on in my career, 1974, I raised baby walrus, usually 8 at a time. Baby walrus are the most cuddly. It's like a 150, 180 pound baby that just wants to sit in your lap and cuddle with you and swim with you. I love walrus. I still love walrus. My Facebook page is a picture of me kissing a walrus in Russia a couple of years ago.
Oh, wow.
Walrus. I also like vultures. I like certainly the condors, but also African vultures. They're very intelligent. Those are probably my 2 favorite.
Wonderful.
Well, and cows. I love cows.
This is from Cheryl. What can we do in Cleveland towards conservation?
Well, any number of things. Conservation is a huge subject. I mean, the first thing I would say, because I'm biased, is I would join the Cleveland Zoological Society if you're not a member. They do great work. Most of the conservation work Cleveland Zoo does is funded through the Zoological Society. Now, Metroparks also contributes, time and energy and stuff, but the Zoo Society funds a lot of that. Certainly joining those organizations. But if you join those organizations, they'll also give you specific things to do if you're talking about specific areas of conservation. I mean, here in Cleveland, I'll give you another one. There's a program in Cleveland called Lights Out Cleveland. Has to do with getting the lights out downtown during migratory neotropical migrants. They use volunteers. They do a great job. Amazing.
I have to say that Larry Wilson is very involved with that. So he was the person who did your introduction tonight. And we're so glad that he's part of that. What was the most memorable wild location you visited?
Oh, I get asked that one a lot too. You know, I really don't know if I had one. I've never been a place I didn't like. I mean, Antarctica was amazing because it's just so unlike anything else. But now that I've said that, I spent a summer in Iceland, and that's kind of unlike anything else also. I think the times I enjoyed the most was when I was living and working with groups of indigenous or local people, whether it's with Eskimos on a small island off Siberia or other communities, certainly in my work in Venezuela. I don't think I have a favorite one.
Well, you certainly have been to many places that would be hard to compare with. Sounds like a fascinating life. This is from Gloria. Are you aware that some gorillas in the San Diego Zoo think I came down with COVID-19, but they are doing well?
Yes. And also there's been some COVID with tigers in various zoos. I mean, COVID-19 is a virus that came to us through the animal world and actually came through us through a conservation problem, which is the illegal wildlife trade and these wet markets and stuff. Again, this is a problem that we cause by interacting in a negative or wrong way with wildlife.
This question is from Dorothy. She was wondering again, what was the percentage of wetlands that Ohio has lost?
Ohio, it's estimated that Ohio lost 90% of the wetlands it had when European settlers came here. So we'll say in the 1720, 1730, 90% of them are gone.
Wow. This is from Anne. What is done to keep animals, especially orphans, but also animals from raised eggs, etc., from imprinting on the zoo staff who feed and...
Good question. If animals are raised at a zoo and they're probably going to stay at a zoo, that's less of an issue. Now, there's a difference between imprinting an animal on a human and having animals habituated to humans. Those are two different things. But certainly animals that were going to be done for release programs, like the condors, efforts were made not to spend a lot of time with them. Condors that were raised in zoos are raised behind a black curtain with a condor puppet with background noises. So the baby condor for the first 60 days doesn't really see a person, very rarely. They see a condor puppet, they see that environment. But with the trumpeter swans, what we found was those cygnets were raised at the zoo, and then they were around people, although at the wilds they weren't so much. But many of these animals, when they get to the point where they're going from juvenile to adult and hormones start kicking in, they generally are hardwired to act like they're supposed to. So it's not a problem, but it's something you have to be aware of.
This is Diana Steele. I just want to jump in here and ask a question because I was in Venezuela in 1997 and encountered 3 of the Andean Condors in the Andes, and they were the most enormous birds I've ever seen. They looked like they could carry off a small child. They were quite impressive. But I'm wondering what the status of condors is in Venezuela now, because I haven't been able to find out if there are any wild condors left or only in captivity.
The issue in Venezuela, I mean, there's a number of issues in Venezuela right now. Largely unknown, but the Venezuelan Andes is a very narrow strip, very narrow habitat. Actually, in most areas, it's maybe 100 miles wide, coming through Colombia, the Santa Marta Mountains. So frequently, condors it's hard to tell what's a Colombian condor and what's a Venezuelan condor in that area. The normal range, at least in Peru and other countries where it's been studied, it's not unusual for condors to have a range of 120 miles a day, 140 miles a day. They catch the thermals and just go. So there's a lot of cross movement there, but to a large degree, there are some exceptions, but to a large degree, most conservation work at this moment, there are some exceptions, fortunately, in Venezuela are on hold. Venezuela is just trying to eat and just trying to survive.
This is from Sarah. If you had unlimited resources and funding, what would be your dream conservation project and why?
Unlimited resources and funding. Well, no, I don't know. It would probably be, I could think of 10 projects I would want to start supporting tomorrow that badly need support, 10 or 12 in various locations. I also think that a effort would be needed to, on a routine basis, bring individuals from other countries here to study and learn for short periods of time and then return back home. And also to send expertise and training to keep this going. It's sort of slowed down a little bit. If you're talking about individual projects, scaly-sided mergansers in Russia, there's a number of things that need help, and it's usually the programs that aren't as popular as others. Tigers are getting support, gorillas are getting support. Now, do they need more support? Of course they do. Do they need work? Of course they do. Probably one of the biggest populations in peril in the world today are amphibians. Amphibians are just having a horrible time, and they don't raise the interest of a lot of groups because they're amphibians.
And I think you answered this for our group before our meeting started. Do you have any pets at home now?
So any pets at home now? We have 2 cats, a Maine Coon and a shelter cat. And recently, 2.5 weeks ago, have a collie puppy. So we're going through puppy raising and puppy and cat refereeing, but it's working fine.
And I have one question. Are there any projects you're working on now, and is there any way that other people could get involved to help you with it?
At the moment, I would say if people locally really wanted to do something now, I would look at Lights Out Cleveland. That's a program that really is doing good job through the rehab work is done at Lake Erie Science Center, and then Andy Jones is doing a lot of good science. Lights Out Cleveland is doing great work. If you really wanted to help out, I think Ohio Young Birders, there's a chapter in Cleveland. I work with the Millersburg chapter. They can always use help. And the thing about it is $100 or $200 there does amazing things. If somebody really wanted to help out and has unlimited money and resources, have them get a hold of me offline and I'll send them in some neat directions.
Wonderful. And this is from Ryan T. Searles. Did you know your wonderful son was in the picture with the swans being released?
I did not, but I do now. I don't know why he wasn't in school that day, but he should have been.
Oh, very good. I think I have one more question here. Are you planning on writing a book on your life experiences? This is from Esther. I think it would be a great read.
If Esther wants to ghostwrite it for me, tell her to come on over and I'll start working with her.
Very good. I think we will wrap it up with that. And again,
jump in here. I put a couple of resources in the chat about Lights Out Cleveland and Ohio Young Birders Club. You could
wonderful
for more information.
And you have, is that showing?
You have to look in the chat.
Thanks for the plug for Stan. Thanks for the plug for Lights Out. It's an amazing It's a great program.
It is. In the organizational aspects of that, I was working with Andy and Matt Schubar and a couple others to get that going.
Yeah.
And
Thank you.
to me, that's citizen science at its best.
All right. Thank you so much, Stan. That was
Oh,
just,
wait, I forgot.
Oh.
Also, if people want to donate money, I hear that there's a local Audubon chapter that's got a great bluebird project.
we do have that. That's a terrific program. Thank you for that.
And I
plug.
love bluebirds. I raise them in my backyard.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Well, that was fascinating, and you certainly have led a very interesting life.
Thank you.
We appreciate all that you have done.
All right.
Terrific.
Thanks.
So we'll go on to just a few announcements. Our board met last Tuesday, and as I've been trying to do, I wanted to spotlight some of the things that we have been doing and projects that we support. So at our meeting last week, we decided to, first of all, to continue with Zoom until through the rest of this season. So through May, we will be having the rest of our meetings on Zoom. So our next one will be March 2nd. And this will be with Bob Dolgan. And he will be talking about a project to work with protecting piping plovers in Chicago. So it sounds like a very interesting program as well. Also, I wanted to let you know that one of our projects and a couple of projects that we've been working on were putting new signage both at Lorain County Community College at our nature trail there, so to help identify wildflowers and plants that are along the trail. And also, we are putting up a new sign in Mill Hollow to give you some educational information about the purple martins that roost there. We have purple martin houses that are part of our nesting program, and there will be a lovely new sign that's going to go up there. If you want to see one that's like it, there is also a sign like that at Lakeview Park at the purple martin houses there. And I think that is all. Check wingtips for any further information and our website for information on other programs that are coming up, and hopefully a possibility that we might be able to get some field trips going later on this year or maybe this summer. And again, I'm hoping that we'll be able to get back in person in September. We hope that that will work. So I think with that, we hope to see you next March 2nd at 7 o'clock. And I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of this month, and we'll see you then. So good night.